Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Deputy Secretary. Thank you. I'm going to follow up very quickly on the previous line of questioning. I agree with that. I think most of us do. And I appreciated your response about you all are not designed to pass an audit. I think that's a partial explanation. I got to say, the bad news and good news. Bad news is you're bad at audits. The good news is you're good at protecting national security, killing bad guys, and bringing world stability. And I think that's important to recognize. But again, we have to get a little better on that. I think one of the challenges that I would imagine sitting in your chair are the range of issues that any one of us might ask. It puts you in a hot seat. I'm going to do that a little bit today, and I mean many times they're technical or local oriented, and I'm going to do that as well. There's 1,000 questions I could ask you, but I think this one is, again, important to my district, important actually to our national security, and that is the Dugway Proving Ground, which is a national asset. It is in my district. It's designated as a major range and test facility base, and it's the home of the Western Desert Test Center. The team at Dugway are really, really good at what they do. They provide that critical capability to test a wide variety of defensive and protective equipment. And for those of us in the military who'd relied on that equipment to protect us in a biological or chemical attack, I think you understand, or even radiological, even explosive, you understand the importance of that. It's uniquely qualified. If you've never been there, it's one of the most isolated, frankly, kind of lonely places in the United States. But that's what makes it perfect. It's enormous. It's varied landscape. You can test in desert. You can test in mountains. It's very realistic training. Now to my concern. I'm very concerned that your budget eliminates all funding for the readiness level of technology upgrades to the West Desert Test Facility, and particularly to the Biological Test Division. What it comes down to is this. The department's rationale for cutting the funding seems to be that this program does not directly support an advanced national defense strategy, and you're turning it over essentially to the Army, which isn't equipped or budgeted to do that. Again, share your thoughts with me on this. Why are these concerns misdirected, and if they are, why? And if they're not, how can we address it?
So I'll need to look into this particular realignment. I think when we have met with the services, they've all emphasized the importance and the value of our test ranges and the need to be able to conduct testing. And when we have some programs that allow each service to test on others' ranges and make sure they're able to take advantage of the technology. I'm not familiar with this particular realignment from one group to the Army. I will look into this one. But in the end of the day, we understand the role that test ranges play in the importance of making sure the equipment we have delivers and performs as we need it to do so.
Well, let me add just a little bit of detail that I think will maybe help you as you look into that. Again, as an MRTFB, as I've described, public law, which I could go into and tell you the number, but I'm sure you will be able to find that. It provides direct stewardship for this national treasure to be supported by OSD. And yet again, the budget request seems to place that onus on the Army, which is by law, it's a DOD responsibility. So would you look at that and get back with us? We'd appreciate it. We're concerned that this misalignment is going to have negative impacts on our ability to defend our soldiers.
Congressman, I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Norquist. I had an amendment in last year's NDAA requiring a report on the costs of overseas bases and operations. It was due on February 15th, but I haven't received it from your department. I'm wondering if you know when we should expect to receive that.
I will go look and find out what the status of that is, Congresswoman.
I appreciate that. I want to continue discussing the high costs found in your DOD budget proposal. I'm sure you're quite aware that the United States outspends the rest of the world in military spending. Under this administration, the military spending has increased to near historic highs, with the majority of funding being used to modernize our nuclear weapons and missile system. At what cost? You will see in the first figure that the lack of federal investment in our infrastructure has contributed to the United States failing behind many other nations. The other graphic is a recent headline that shows how health and education outcomes have declined in the United States compared to our global peers as well. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit the University of Washington study in this article into the record.
Without objection.
Given the Pentagon's constant funding increases, it seems clear to me that we don't need to spend more money on our overflowing arms stockpile. We instead need to start investing in our human capital for the benefits of both our national security and greater society. Are you worried that the drastic cuts proposed to non-defense spending could affect our national security?
Congresswoman, I'm going to let the other secretaries speak to their budgets because each of them was part of designing those.
Shouldn't we be reinvesting in domestic programming that directly contribute to the health, education, and development of the American people in order to strengthen our security here and abroad?
So we have programs inside defense to make sure we strengthen our security. I leave you to this committee and others to work on what the proper ranges of the domestic agencies are.
Do you have any concerns that our long-term national security could be at risk if we don't invest in the physical, mental, and financial well-being of our youngest generation?
So we always have the issue in the Department of Defense on recruiting. And so we emphasize trying to bring in the right skill sets and the right recruits, and we focus on doing that. So making sure we have a well-prepared population to do that is always important to the Department of Defense.
How do you expect a future leader will be able to fill your role one day without sufficient government support at home?
So I think one of the things that we always continue to look at in the Department of Defense is making sure that we, as we bring in the young men and women into the military, that we have the right programs to train them on their equipment and technologies they need to be able to perform. One of the things you brought up is the difference between what we spend on our military in other countries, but other countries like China predominantly use conscription, and so that they don't have to pay their people very much to have them. One of the values of our freedom, though, is that we believe a volunteer force is more effective. It is more expensive, but then the freedom of other individuals to not have to serve in a conscription is very important to our country as well. So there are differences in how we fund, and we want to keep the fight as an away game, which means we pay and have the cost of the lift to keep it overseas.
Well, one of the great differences between the amount of money China is spending and the amount of money the United States is spending is China doesn't have to spend on the number of overseas bases like we do here in the United States. And I know that our job here in this committee is to look at our budget as a whole. And if we are to think about putting together a budget that has our values and principles intact, we should really think about what it means for us to fully invest in educating our population, in caring for their health, in investing in proper infrastructure, and protecting ourselves here domestically as we do internationally. So thank you so much for being here. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back, and now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank the secretary for being here. When you were here last year, I think I opened noting that we were approximately $22 trillion in debt, and we're mounting about $100 million of debt per hour. Are you aware of what the debt is today?
I think the deficit is $23.5 trillion.
Debt, yeah, total debt,
Total debt, I'm sorry, debt, not
trillion.
deficit, total $23.5 trillion.
Yeah, about 23.4 trillion. We're racking up about $110 million of debt an hour. You know, this quote has been used a number of times by a number of folks, but former Secretary General Mattis agreed that the national debt was one of our greatest national security threats. Do you agree with that? Do you agree that the extent to which we are spending far more than we are able to pay for is a potential negative impact to our national security in the future?
Yes.
With respect to interest, for example, I think it's projected that we could have interest, and it depends on all the assumptions, right? Based on interest rates, based on growth, based on spending. But you know, some projections have us at $819 billion by 2030. I think that's the CBO's projection. OMB's might be different based on its numbers. But that puts us at getting close to 1-to-1, that we're spending as much interest as we are on national defense. You know, again, Is this something that you believe that Congress needs to move up in terms of our readiness and our ability to defend the United States of America abroad to get our fiscal house in order? Is that something that is front and center for national defense strategy?
So when you think of national defense strategy, you need to think of both security and solvency, right? You need the military to protect the country that allows for the investments in the economy and free navigation of the water, but you need the solvency to be able to continue to pay your bills and achieve your goals. And so both of those have to be done in balance. It's one of the challenges, one of the reasons and focuses of this committee is those exact types of strategic trade-offs.
Well, thank you for that. And speaking of that, could you comment on what your perspective and the Defense Department's perspective is on the numbers put forward in the Democrats' proposed budget?
Are you referring to something out of this budget committee?
Yes.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that document.
Right, because it doesn't exist. Yet we're sitting here talking about the president's budget with some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle making criticisms of that budget, but yet we haven't taken up the work of doing that in this committee or in this body, which strikes me as puzzling. Now, I will say I do appreciate Congresswoman Jayapal's focus on a audit, and so you said it's helpful, so let me add to the helpfulness by suggesting that it would be very good for us to move the audit through more expeditiously and not just getting a couple more per year. So please pass that on as well, that is uniformly agreed to in this body, which is not often something we can say, but I think we definitely we want to see that.
I have appreciated the bipartisan support, and on more than one occasion when I've had someone who is less enthusiastic than I think they need to be, I offer to arrange a meeting with them, with one of the members of Congress, so they can explain if they think this is not important, and it usually helps solve the problem.
Well, indeed, and I think it is critically important, and so I do appreciate that and appreciate your attention to that, and anything we can do to push on that even further, just at the highest levels, it's something that's critically important. I do want to say something about this point on the 35% of the world's defense spending, 7 times the next high, or more than 7 times the most recent highest level of 7 countries spending. Where are we, though, today relative to China, Russia, and some of our national threats in terms of our ability to deal with multiple threats around the world, and how important is it that we have the level of defense spending that we're talking about to defend the interests of the United States at home and abroad?
So I think what we have to look at is the behavior of those countries and the challenge and the risk they pose. So what you have with China is, while the U.S. supports a free and open Pacific that recognizes the rights of each country and promotes stability, the Chinese are continuing to harass Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, disrupt those rights. They are investing in their Navy. They're expanding the size of their force. They're investing in long-range missile strike technologies designed to create direct threats to the U.S. Navy. And then in Russia, you have similar things. You have a country that has invaded the Crimea, has occupied parts of several neighboring countries.
Right.
Each of them presents a very different threat, one more land-based, one more sea-based. Both of them away games, which is much preferable to having threats coming straight here, but they're extending the range of what they can do into the United States.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's important for us to keep the defense spending. And as I note that the president's budget has defense spending going up modestly over the next 10, 15 years, and that's important. The last point I'll make, and I know I'm winding down my time, Mr. Chairman, is that with respect to the coronavirus situation, I just want to note that we've sent letters to DOD that have not been responded to. We sent them 2.5 weeks ago with respect to the people moving to San Antonio to Lackland to just ensure that San Antonio is being considered in how we're handling those who are being cared for at Lackland. So I'd appreciate a response on that, and that San Antonio be, consulted in terms of how our medical facilities in the community are going to be used or assumed to be used when we have individuals who may be exposed and may exhibit symptoms at Lackland.
Congressman, I'll make sure that the letter is answered. I know we have done briefings to the Hill on a weekly basis, but we'll make sure we answer the letter.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I thank Deputy Secretary Norquist for his presence here. Not wanting to take up all of my time, but give me a brief answer to the gentleman's question from Texas, and that is, what is the Defense Department protocols for the medical care? Is it military medical care that's being utilized for individuals that are quarantined, or using civilian medical care, and are you then intending to reimburse those civilian resources that are going to be used even though persons are quarantined on the basis?
So the individuals that we're talking about in the quarantine are not DOD personnel, and they're not people who are employed or supported by the Department of Defense. They're American citizens.
No, I am well aware of that.
So we don't have legal authority to reimburse somebody for their medical care because they're not somebody we support.
So you are just, you're just have accepted them as a non-involved host. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. We get reimbursed by HHS to provide basically a housing arrangement where they can be quarantined that meets HHS's standards.
And then, so if there is need for medical care of these individuals, who is engaging with that?
So
base.
HHS works with either the local community, or in some case, they've been flown to other facilities based on what is the right place to provide them the appropriate level of medical care. Sometimes it's local community, sometimes it's not, but I defer to HHS on how they make those decisions.
So you are a landlord, if you will, and you're being paid by HHS.
In this case, yes, we provide those facilities to house them while they're in quarantine.
Then secondarily, have you established a protocol for active duty military that may, as we understand, there's one, there may be another one that may be infected by the coronavirus?
Yes, so we have processes that we deal with when somebody inside the Department of Defense is identified. We go through the proper quarantining, we follow the CDC standards.
I see that the budget has gone from about $738 billion to $740 billion. Where is the money? Has the money already been snatched as it relates to the building of the wall?
So the FY21 budget request, it is not our expectation, and we do not foresee that there will be a requirement to do border wall construction in 21. We believe that what the president is planning to do will meet his requirement in 20 and prior years. So we don't anticipate a need or foresee one to realign any of the funds, or we're not asking for any in 21.
Well, in this instance, the president never asked anyone, as you well know. He just presumptively and willy-nilly snatches money away from people. But obviously, this is a very big budget. So are you telling me that you've already expended dollars for the wall in the last fiscal year, 2020?
So in 2019, we funded money for the wall under authorities 284 and 2808. And in fiscal year 20, this year, we have realigned funding under the authority of Section 284. And that's the money that we are currently looking to execute this year in support of the border wall.
Hasn't gone yet, but you are still in the...
I don't know if it started to be obligated yet, but it's been realigned.
I'm frustrated, Mr. Chairman, as to whether, just speaking into the record, frustrated by the fact that we cannot find a way to, in essence, withdraw that power for the Defense Department to reprogram those dollars without the authority of the United States Congress. Let me ask, is the spread of the coronavirus a national security risk in your perspective? Would you say that the non-defense investments to combat the spread of such diseases and prevent pandemics are part of our national security? Should we look at it in that manner?
So I think it's important for the security of the homeland that we properly address this. I think that the president and the interagency team have taken strong steps with first limiting the flights, doing screening, established quarantining. We'll have to see how this disease continues to spread as we try and buy time as they work on vaccines and therapeutics to address it. But it's a serious issue, and we are taking it seriously.
Would you put in the category of a national security issue, particularly as it spreads so quickly? It can spread so quickly.
It can become one as it continues to spread, yes.
I have been working consistently on another matter, triple-negative breast cancer, the number of women that you've had in the United States military. Would you look into tracking the funding for that? It obviously deals with treating active duty military women, and it is a more deadly form of cancer. Been working on that for more than a decade. I'd like a response back on working with me on funding of that area and working with your members, women members of your military active duty in terms of triple-negative breast cancer.
Congresswoman, I'd be happy to work with you on looking into that issue.
And just as a follow-up, do you think it's a better investment in stopping the coronavirus or working on a wall that has shown no value?
So when I talked to the Border Patrol agents on the southwest border and asked them about the value of the wall, they were very clear. The individual I talked with in the Border Patrol said it works. It has made a significant difference in theirs. We as a nation have to balance our ability to both secure our borders and secure the health of our people, and those are some of the trade-offs that we make across the country.
Mr. Chairman, just one question. When OMB withheld Ukraine assistance funding last summer, did anyone at OMB or the White House tell you why they withheld these funds?
I'm not familiar with, my understanding is we received documents from OMB asking us to wait, and then we received documents telling us to go, and then we released the money accordingly.
So
I
they
don't
gave
have
you-
anything to further to add in terms of the cause or what was being
No
looked at.
explanation at all.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Deputy Secretary, for being here. Just a quick question. In the face of a global pandemic, would you rather have less border security or more border security?
You're always better off with more border security.
Okay. Do physical barriers contribute to border security?
They very clearly support border security.
Going back to the audit we were talking about, I want to go into a little bit more detail on that. The DOD was able to complete the first ever audit, found about $5.7 billion of efficiencies present. Can you talk a little bit more about what that process was? I've heard it's called the night court, where we're looking at unexecuted funds and seeing how we can reprogram those. What does that process look like? How do you decide where to reprogram them?
Sure, so what you're talking about, I believe, for the $5.7 billion is called the defense-wide review, a meeting the Secretary and I chaired. And what we did is we walked through the part of the defense budget that's not assigned to the Army, Navy, the Air Force, what we call the fourth estate. And what we looked for was not necessarily things that were bad or wasteful, but less important and something we'd give up in order to be able to invest in the higher end fight. Hypersonics, artificial intelligence moves in the right direction. So we looked at programs that had been started decades ago where the funding level was steady, and the answer is it still necessary? And in some of those, we brought those funding levels down. We looked at foreign military sales. We charge other countries for the overhead cost, but we didn't charge them for the full overhead cost. So the answer is, well, this is an area where it's they're buying the weapon, they should pay the fully loaded cost. So we've come to Congress with an authority change to do that. We finished some of the transfers that were to DLA that drive efficiency in the way they operate. We're right-sizing some of the medical treatment facilities. Not easy choices, but we have a flat top line. We've got to find reforms internally, and this is what the taxpayers expect us to do in order to be able to meet the future challenges.
And in next year's budget, I understand you're going to a zero-based budget review. What do you expect to see in that process?
Sure. So what the Secretary did when he was in the Army was called night courts, and he went through and he did a zero-based review of the Army budget. He has asked for the Air Force and the Navy in this cycle to do the same thing, which really goes back to look at each of the items, even things that have been steady state in the past, and ask, are those still the highest priority? Not are they useful, but are they the highest priority compared to the things you are not able to do now? And if they're not, realign the money.
And one concern I have, especially from my own time in the military, is frivolous end-of-year spending. What can we do to get a handle on the spending sprees that go on, not just in the DOD, of course, but throughout government at the end of the fiscal year? What incentives can we put in place so that commanders feel obligated to give that money back to the Treasury?
Right, so what happens in the federal government and in defense is when you get to year end, you have this odd use it or lose it, which is you have $100. If you spend it by 1 October, you get what you bought it for. But by 1 October, if you haven't, it goes away altogether. This is not how you and I handle our salaries. We do not get to the end of the calendar year and then take all the money we earned and hand it back into our employer if we didn't spend it. This creates some very bad incentives for people to spend money at year end. It adds to things being put in inventory that we don't have awareness. We have a proposal in the budget, which is an authority that other federal agencies have, which says to someone, if you don't spend it, your organization gets to have 50 cents on the dollar next year. And our idea is if you are looking at year end and what you're looking at isn't as valuable to you as 50 cents on the dollar next year, we'd rather you not buy it. And I think that sort of incentive, which some of the other federal agencies have, is a step in the right direction to drive down that wasteful spending.
Is that a new idea, or have you implemented that yet?
It's a new idea we have proposed in this year's budget.
Okay.
To go in, so we'd ask for this committee and others' members' support of that provision.
Okay. Can you send us more details on that?
I'd be happy to, sir.
That'd be great. I want to, in my limited time, I want to talk about acquisition processes. And what have you guys done to improve acquisition processes and make them more efficient over the last couple of years? And do you believe we are in a good place yet to really take advantage of the new cutting-edge innovation, not often being done by the bigger defense contractors, but by smaller companies? Are we able to quickly take advantage of that?
We are working to. So let me get to your first question, which is we had in the past a long acquisition process. The Congress made some changes. They split our research office from our acquisition office. They gave us authorities to streamline some of these. We, in the last few months, have issued the guidance to implement those. We have mid-tier acquisition as an example, rapid prototyping, Those are some of the new processes that allow us to move in a more expedited manner. Those are very successful. We appreciate it. The Army's IVAS program is another example of doing this. There's more to be done. You know, we need to be more, we continue to do outreach to smaller companies that don't have traditional experience, but we're still a hard partner to deal with, and we have a lot of rules that we bring, and trying to reduce those and facilitate that transition is key.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Deputy Secretary Norquist, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to come here. As we talked briefly, I wanted to mention a little bit about my district on the Central Coast of California and many of the military installations there, from Navy Postgraduate School, Defense Language Institute, Fleet Numerical, Naval Research Lab, Camp Roberts, Fort Hunter Liggett, and a few others that are there. Obviously, you know, very concerned with making sure that they continue to contribute to our national security and have the resources to do that. But I have to say, one of the ways that they do that is with the Office of Economic Adjustment, OEA, which you've heard of quite a bit, which I do believe supports the readiness and resiliency of those types of military installations and defense communities around the country, not just on the Central Coast, by furthering the priorities of the National Defense Strategy. The OEA has provided a tremendous value to many local installations by responding to defense job losses, reductions in defense economic activity, tax-based reductions, mission needs for increased public services and infrastructure, and local missions being impaired by civilian activity as well. And some of the programs of interest include the Community Investment Program, Military Installation Sustainability Program, the Downsizing Program, that type of program which assists states and local governments in response to DOD force modernization, whether it be through BRAC or other processes. And, you know, recently, as you know, Secretary of Defense, Esper, recently completed the defense-wide review. And it was in that, he did that to obviously improve the alignment of time and money and people for the NDS priorities. The DWR was a comprehensive examination of the DOD organizations outside of the military departments, and one of those was the OEA. Now, as you know well, in the FY20, we enacted the funding for OEA of almost $450 million. I think it was $449.6 million. Yet, this president's budget cuts more than $418 million from OEA. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, given the significance of OEA and how important it is, not just to our districts, but clearly in Congress by allocating them as much as we did in FY20, was that understanding accepted in this administration, considering the significant amount of cuts for OEA?
So first of all, put the cuts in the framework. We don't normally request $450 million. I think we request a much smaller amount. Most of those are ads put in by Congress. From the number we had, what we did in the defense-wide review is we looked at the types of things we were funding, and I forget the exact number for OEA, and brought that down in order to free up that money for artificial intelligence, hypersonics, and others. But as you point out, this is an area of congressional interest. There are frequently ads put in on it to address concerns that Congress had. Those would still continue, of course, as Congress directs us to do those. Okay,
so what you're saying is that even though Congress had that number, would you say a majority of that number was congressional interest?
Yes.
Okay.
It wasn't in the president's budget, it was in the enacted budget.
Understood, understood. How much did the president want to cut OEA last year? Not this year, but last year. What was his request?
Again, remember, most of these are initiatives and projects, so it's not like it's a steady state, you know, if you have a certain number of people over a certain number of years. We fund the small staff that runs it. These are a particular initiative to assist a particular base. So usually once the funding is done, my understanding is the initiative is done. So it's each year you have to decide what you want to do separately for that year.
Understood, understood. Well, just know that we'll continue to fight for OEA based on the importance to our district and look forward to funding it appropriately. Thank you again for being here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depending on whether Mr. Womack returns.
I thank the chairman. Deputy Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for taking all of our questions today. I want to go back to some of the suggestions that the Defense Department spending has just been running amok. I've only been in Congress for 9 years. More often than not, spending has gone down in your department as opposed to up. I don't want to conflate the DOD budget with the VA budget. Of course, veteran spending has gone up each and every year, and I think that's something that we share on both sides of the aisle. Defense Department spending as a share of GDP more likely to go down during the time I've been in Congress than to go up. Budget Committee member, I want to see that balanced budget. I appreciate you knowing right off the top of your head where our national debt is, because that is also a national security issue, as we've discussed. As we try to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, and certainly good supporters, great supporters of our men and women in uniform, talk to me about that balance between spending too little and spending too much. I appreciated you making the point with Mr. Panetta that President and DOD are setting what they believe are national security priorities. If the Congress wants to go a different direction, they're welcome to spend money any way the Congress wants to spend money. But the President's budget is focused on national security. Tell me about that balance between spending too little and spending too much.
So what we look for is we understand that the fundamental importance of the Department of Defense to everything else that the country does and the government does. What we do every day works under the assumption that you can safely ship things across the ocean, that you have access to that we have free trade, that we don't have threats immediately on our border, that we are able to work with a network of allies, that other countries are free and independent. All of this depends on a strong military. There's the ability to deter other countries from engaging in conventional war provides us an unbelievable level of peace and stability. It drives them to either unconventional or terrorist operations, it drives them to cyber attacks, but that's because it's keeping them from a conventional war. That ability drives the success of the U.S. economy. It makes everything else in the federal budget possible. It allows the government to have the revenue it does. You want to size that right. You get it wrong, placing second in a war is bad. It's catastrophically bad. So you want to make sure you get that right. But it's not something that just automatically needs to be higher. So when we look at defense, what is necessary to meet the mission that we have been given? Right now, we're 3.1% of GDP. That's incredibly low compared to where we've been in the past. We think in the future we need to be careful not to fall too far, that we keep that level up. But if we can provide the security, then we have done our mission properly. And what we have to do is look across those range of near-term and long-term threats to make sure that we don't fail the American people by providing the freedom and the security that they depend on.
They're much more likely that my constituents will identify with your terrorist mission than identify with keeping shipping lanes open. So much in the DOD budget that folks don't realize is there. There was a time Corps of Engineers would have been the only group large enough to do major construction projects. May not be true in 2020. Didn't used to think about the DOD as a place for top-notch medical research, but now the congressionally directed medical research program is growing each and every year. Tell me about those what I would call ancillary missions to the national security mission that you laid out.
Right, so the Department of Defense, because of the range of things we do, we end up with a medical research arm. I mean, think about it, our forces are deployed all around the world. There was a time in history where disease killed more people in the military than combat or anything else. So we're used to what do we need to do to be able to safely deploy troops into the Middle East, into Africa, into parts of Asia to make sure they're protected. And we do research on those, and we maintain the records, and in some cases we have some of the best databases, and we're working very closely with CDC and others to make sure that our research is available to them and our research individuals are available. Likewise, we have large populations which we provide medical support. Again, not on the same scale as the private sector, but we have niche areas in which we have an expertise because of the types of injuries we are trying to solve, and that provides a benefit to other communities as well.
So as the president is going through trying to prioritize spending across those categories, whereas as it relates to OEA, the president might say, I don't find this to be a core mission. If Congress wants to fund it, Congress can fund it. When it comes to the Corps of Engineers, when it comes to congressionally directed medical research, those have been places that I have seen the administration place priority. That is a shared vision.
Right, and the Secretary's view, to get to this point, is you are better off with agencies that come forward and say, I am willing to and believe these are lower priority to invest in something else than someone who comes forward and says, I have to have everything and then something, right? The answer is, you expect us to do due diligence over our budget and to make prioritization choices. You may not agree, you may change them, that's fine. They may adjust OEA, that's fine. But you expect us to scrub them, say these are the things we think we need to stop, these are systems that we need to retire, and this is what we need to invest in. And we can defend and explain why we're doing that.
I know that transparency is welcome on both sides of the aisle. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman didn't get 10 minutes today, only 5. But his time has expired. Now recognize the ranking member for 10 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and thank you, Mr. Norquist. Sorry I had to unplug. We had the Southcom commander in his hearing over on the appropriation side, and I felt obligated to spend some time with Admiral Fowler over there. My principal question is in regard, and I think this has already come up today, and I apologize if it has, the reprogramming of dollars for the border wall, which I support building that wall. I've been on record as saying that since the time I've been here in Congress. However, it looks like that this year the bill payer is the National Guard. For the most part, you took all of the Ingria money, the Humvee modernization money, C-130Js, and so on. And as I explained in a previous hearing, as a guardsman, I remember the days when I was an armor officer and jumping off the back of an M60A3 TTS tank, knowing that if I ever deployed to a combat theater and fell in on a tank, it was not going to be the M60A3, it was going to be the M1. And so I used that example as to support my argument that we said around the turn of the new millennium to our National Guardsmen that we plugged into the war fight right after 9/11, my battalion being one of the first out, that they were no longer going to be treated as a hand-me-down force, that we were going to make sure that they were manned properly, that they were trained properly, they were equipped properly, so that when they left their home station and went to pre-deployment training, that they were going to be falling in on the equipment that they've been training on and that they would see in theater. This is a step backward from that, in my strong opinion. And it's not just the fact that the Ingria account has been zeroed out or that the Humvee modernization has been zeroed out. Maybe the most important issue at play here is the message that we are sending to our citizen soldiers. I think it's a step backward. And I think if it's a one-year issue, that may be one thing. I am concerned that it could become the bill payer for other things, and I want to make sure that there's somebody up here advocating for the men and women that are scattered across this country, doing something else today, but this weekend will be training to go fight for their country. And I think it's a terrible message that we're sending to our men and women in the reserve component structure. So I want to ask you, really, why? And let me just add to it. As I understand the discussion, the question was put by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to the National Guard leader, General Engel, the question of whether there was a strategic issue with the transfer of these funds. And I understand that General Engel looked at it and said it's not that we're going to lose a war by losing these funds. But remember, the National Guard has another mission as well that sometimes we are too quick to forget, and that is they've got a state mission. And some of this equipment is extremely important and vital to the accomplishment of their state missions, which will happen every single year. So to you, Mr. Norquist, can we get some assurance that we're not going to go back to the National Guard year over year and take these funds for other purposes and continue to make them a bill payer?
So first of all, we value the National Guard. It's not our intent or expectation that would happen with regard to the wall. We don't foresee that next year. But I think the important thing is, and let me address sort of the why, because there was no intent to create any impression on the Guard. We value the Guard, we understand and role their mission. So let me just walk through a few of the items. So for example, the Humvees, the Army's transitioning to the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. So when asked about that funding, we went to the services. Is this something that we asked for in the budget? Is this something that when you asked for money above and beyond the budget, and each of the services had, was it in there? Is this something that you need for the future? The Army said, we're moving away from the Humvee, we're headed to the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. With regard to the other National Guard equipment, we had put in the budget a request for about $4.5 billion for the National Guard for equipment. Congress funded it. We supported that. That is not affected. There is a congressional ad that has happened over the last several years, this one of about $1.3 billion. So we looked at that and we said, is that urgent? Is that important? And what we saw was the congressional ads for the previous 2 years, there was still $1.5 billion that hadn't been spent yet. So there's still a $1.5 billion this year for additional Guard equipment. So there was more of it wasn't the emphasis on the priority of the Guard. With some of the ship choices and others, we said, is it money we need today and this year, or is it something that's going to follow later after this year's funding has been spent?
Well, to be fair now, that INGREA spending is a 3-year obligation, correct?
Correct. Normally, it's with most of our procurement, they normally spend mostly in the first year, but you have up to 3.
But
Correct.
so isn't it a bit unfair to take a snapshot in time and claim you've got all this unfunded revenue sitting there that can be used for these other purposes? And again, I go back to what I've said in the beginning. If it's a 1-year anomaly that we're talking about here, I believe our reserve component structure will salute smartly and charge the hill. But I want to be on record for sure, and I want somebody to be able to stand up and tell me that this is not anticipated in future years, i.e. when this Congress plugs in more money for INGREA in FY21 and beyond, that it's not going to be looked at as low-hanging fruit to reprogram for other purposes. And that's because our National Guard and Reserve component, as you've already admitted, is a vital part of our operational force today.
So to answer you specifically, this is not anticipated in future years. I will make you that commitment. I think what I would highlight is for any program that had an entire year's worth of funding unspent in a new year, we would be looking at that program. This isn't a Guard-specific thing. If I had other programs that had that large of a carryover balance, we would be looking them as potential sources in a mid-year reprogramming or something else because it's atypical, right? But I think your key point is this a one-off because of obligation rates or something unusual, or is this a de-emphasis on the Guard? This is not a de-emphasis on the Guard. The Guard is a critical, valuable role. The Secretary recognizes their importance, and we will make sure they're properly supported.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now yield myself 10 minutes for questions. Once again, Deputy Secretary, thank you so much for being here. I kind of curious about some of the comments made by my Republican colleagues about criticisms of this budget. I really haven't heard many criticisms of the budget. I've heard a lot of very good questions and serious questions, and you've treated them as legitimate and serious questions. You mentioned in your statement, you referenced the 79 F-35s that are in this budget. That's been a project which has been controversial, to say the least, taken a long time, lots of revisions in cost and so forth. Could you give us an update on how that project stands now? What we can expect, the cost and so forth?
So the F-35 program is now on track to, I think it's rolling off its 500th aircraft. So it's well into its production. It's producing one of probably the top aircraft in the world, and it provides us incredible capabilities. The cost per aircraft is continuing to come down as we get further into the process, down to, I think, just under $80 million a copy. And one of the things that we are focusing on, and our team is working with them on, is the sustainment cost, right? We have gotten the program, the quality is getting there, the price is coming down, but we need to make sure that the sustainment cost, because this is going to be the core aircraft in our fleet, is something we address. And so that, I think, if you talk about where we're going in the future and focusing on, driving down the maintenance and sustainment costs for that platform will be a focus area for us.
Thank you for that. Recently, the courts ordered work stopped on the Joint Enterprise Defense and Infrastructure Project, also known as JEDI, which is a $10 billion cloud computing contract for the Pentagon. That was because of a legal challenge brought by Amazon, and if anybody's read the news knows, the contract was originally ordered to Amazon, and then it was basically taken away from them and awarded to Microsoft after the president made comments about the Washington Post and Jeff Bezos, the owner of and top stockholder of Amazon and the owner of the Washington Post. Now, I have no idea what went on within the Pentagon in that process, but I am concerned that the president's comments, tweets, and so forth that were aimed at Amazon creates questions in the public's mind as to the credibility of the process. First of all, how important is that project for the Pentagon and it's the Pentagon operations?
So first of all, let me do two things. The project is very important. When you think of what a cloud computing does, imagine if every time you wanted to add an electrical appliance, you had to put an extra power generation system next side your house, your building. That slows it down. The artificial intelligence does the same thing. Instead of buying a server, I plug into the system and the cloud ramps up the capability. So it acts like a power plant, providing lower, higher electricity, lower, higher computing power. And when you think about the demands of the future systems we're fielding are essential. I would like to correct one thing, though, which is in the press, they acted as if there was already a winner and they thought a particular firm would win. That was never the case. The evaluation process was done. Amazon was not selected. Microsoft was, but it wasn't as if there was a reversal in the decision. They were simply one of many competitors, and in the down select, and I would emphasize so the public understands, we have a rigorous acquisition process. The people who evaluate these proposals are divided into separate groups. Each one only sees a segment of it, so they don't know how their scoring affects the overall winner. Generally, their names are not released, so people don't know who to go and influence. They're held to strict criteria. In fact, the court case with the judge is over the particular application of an evaluation criteria. It's not about the president, it's about the criteria. Right. Fair comment, we're working through that, but we have professionals who do this, uniformed military and career civilians. So I would want to say I had confidence in the process, and when I was asked, I did not know who the winner was, but I was asked, can we go forward with the award? I met with the IG's office because I'd promised Congress I would, and I said, before we award, you have been doing an investigation. Have you seen anything that would cause you to advise me not to go forward with the award? And the IG said, no, I have found no reason for you not to go forward with the award. And so we did. And so I just want to reassure people, we followed a diligent process. It was rigorous. It was done appropriately, and we have confidence in it.
Right. Is there a DOD policy in place for forbidding Pentagon officials from making public comments about bids for contracts?
I don't know what the official policy is in terms of commentary, but generally we have a strict process in terms of how we receive and evaluate awards, and we segregate people from those who are allowed to work on the evaluation process and those who don't.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to South Korea for a minute. So we've been paying, South Korea has been paying us $1 billion a year, roughly, to support our 28,000 plus troops in that country, and that agreement has now expired. We don't have an agreement in place, and it's been reported that the president is asking for $5 billion compensation from South Korea, as opposed to $1 billion, a five-fold increase. So I have two questions. What would be the impact of, and what would happen if the South Koreans refuse to pay the $5 billion? I know that there are roughly 9,000 Korean employees working at our facilities to help support our troops over there. So it potentially could be very disruptive to that economy. And does the president's budget contemplate a $5 billion payment from the South Koreans?
So the State Department is the lead on the negotiation, and I think we look forward to working with the South Koreans. The president's been very clear. He wants other countries to increase their investment in their own side, and we support that. In terms of the negotiation, I defer to the State Department on the latest plans or what the backup plan would be if one of them was not enacted. I'll have to get you for the record what assumptions are built into our budget. I think that, I don't know off the top of my
I'd
head.
appreciate that very much. That's actually all I have. So once again, I thank you for your presence here, your responsiveness, as you have done 2 years in a row now. We appreciate that very much. And if there's no further business, this hearing stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.